Hello and welcome to an unusual edition of the book review here at CCXP Exam Simulator. Today I'm going to be looking at two of the best regarded books in the world of storytelling, and we're going to be having our first book fight to decide which is the best. So let's look at the two contenders and their statistics. So, Stories That Stick by Kindra Hill comes in at 240 pages. It has 417 reviews on Amazon and has an amazing average review of 4.9 out of 5. So very impressive. Probably should be regarded as the favourite in this matchup. Now, the contender is The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. This comes in at 304 pages. It's had 121 reviews and it's got an average of 4.5 out of 5. It's still very respectable average. So I'm going to go ahead and give you my top takeaways for the Stories That Stick. So to start off with, the author says, to make a business work, you need to build bridges. Now, when we talk about bridges, essentially what she means is taking someone from A to B in a nice, smooth, controlled manner. So that could be bringing a customer through a sales funnel, for example. It could be helping a customer build an emotional bond with your brand. It could be helping an employee move through the employee experience to really bake in the culture of the workplace. And so the author, Kindra, says that there are three key components to making an effective bridge. So she says, first of all, you need to capture attention. Then you need to exert influence. And finally, you need to create transformation. And she says this is where stories come in because they do that better than anything. She said good stories place people at the intersection of captivation and influence by using cortisol and oxytocin. The reason for this is that when people have to pay attention, and when something comes out and grabs them, there's some kind of contrast in the environment, that will release cortisol in the bloodstream. And likewise, when you build up a bond of trust, you build up some compassion for the protagonist in a story, for example, that releases oxytocin. And what they found is that when you can have both in the bloodstream at the same time, it's very, very effective. She says that we also remember better when we hear stories. And this is because of a particular circuit in the brain called HOME, H-O-M-E. It stands for the Human Oxytocin Mediated Empathy. And the reason that it facilitates learning better is because it hooks into dopamine. And dopamine is a real key neurochemical when it comes to learning something new. She says that in a good story, characters must experience emotion in order for us to empathize with them. If there's no emotion, then that means reduced impact. Because of course we always talk about empathy in the customer experience world, but this is a very key point. It's a lot to do with mirror neurons as well. When you see someone and you see someone going through something in a story, the emotion can almost become contagious. And so that's why it's very important for the characters to go through some kind of an emotional experience, because that will really affect the audience and that will create much more impact. She said stories should have a significant moment and details that allow binding to existing associations. So a significant moment really means that the story just takes place in a very specific time and place as opposed to the rest of the person's life. And then you zoom in on that, and then the details of the things, there could be very specific little details here and there in the story that people can relate to. So for example, you might be telling a story about, like here's a good one off the top of my head. I can't remember the name of the dog, but there was a famous story about a dog that used to go to the train station to wait for its owner to come home every day. And then when his owner passed away, the dog carried on going to the train station every day afterwards. And what people will associate with that story is the loyalty of dogs, companionship, things like that. And so they'll immediately build in their existing associations of loyalty and maybe loyal animals they've had in their lives with that story, and it allows them to emotionally connect with it more. Now she comes up with 4 blueprint type of stories in the book, so we're going to go through each of those. The first one's called the value story. So she says, people don't buy the thing, they buy what the thing will do for them. So when you tell the story about the value that your product or service delivers, be sure that you're explaining what the thing is that's actually the benefit that the person's actually getting, as opposed to just talking about the product itself, which can be a bit boring. The next one is the founder story. So story can help to differentiate. I believe in the book there was an example where a number of people were pitching to get some business, and all the pitches were kind of the same, in terms of like pricing and things like that. But one of the founders came up and told his story, and people could see his passion for that line of work and what had really driven him to be there, and that ended up being the deciding factor. So in the world, we're getting a lot more things become commoditized in this world now, and so that's one way to break free from that, is to have a really compelling founder story. There's also the purpose story. She says, tell your story before someone else does. You might not like their version. So this is important, especially with the employee culture, of making sure that when you onboard people, you really drill in the purpose story. Why do we do what we do? Why is it important? What are our core values? And as she says, if the business doesn't do this, somebody else will. So it's very important to emphasize this. And then there is the customer story. So when you tell a customer story, what you're essentially, the image that you're trying to create in the customer's head is, well, someone else like me has felt my pain and they've used your solution. And really this is testimonials more than anything, because we can get them in all shapes and sizes. So you might have just testimonials on your website. You might have some videos, which can be much more powerful. But either way, when people see other people talking about the success they've had, it's very easy to tell a genuine person apart from an actor as well. So when they can see people have had really genuinely wonderful experiences, then it's more likely to connect with them, and it's more likely to make them a customer, rather than just someone who's a prospect who's not sure about you. And then the last point, which is pretty neat, she says, make a list of people, places, and events if you are looking for a story. So rather than saying to somebody, and I think this again is an example from the book, rather than saying, so what was World War II like? You could find out specifically where they were stationed, and then you could say to them, so tell me what it was like when you were stationed at X. And I think in that example, the person was able to divulge so much information, and then of course their mind free associated, and they went from one memory to the next. So if you're struggling to get a good story out of somebody, focus on the nouns and see if you can pick up some really useful insights by focusing on a people, place, or event. So now we're going to move to the science of storytelling, why stories make us human and how to tell them better, by Will Storr. So these are my top 10 takeaways from this book. So firstly, he says, almost all perception is based on the detection of change. Storytellers create moments of unexpected change that seize attention. Now, it's very important to note that, attention is key. And as the previous book mentioned, once you've grabbed somebody's attention, that's almost like the first step. Obviously they need to build in the trust with the characters. Our brains are hardwired to detect change. And normally if you think about like a film screenplay, for example, the first act doesn't really have too much of that. The first act actually does the trust side, the trust building side. So you create a very interesting character, a very relatable character, and then you throw them a curveball. They go into, like in The Wizard of Oz, they go into Oz. The tornado takes them into a brand new world they've never experienced before. And that unexpected change is powerful because our brains are always looking for change. And when they see it, they want to know how to deal with it. So that is one way to grab the attention of your audiences. He says, brains become spontaneously curious when they are presented with an incomplete information set. And one of the really funny takeaways from this book is you can give someone like the most absurd story and they will still crave the completion of the information set. So this is a reason why mysteries are so successful. J.J. Abrams has a storytelling technique called the mystery box, where basically you give the audience a mystery, and then they are able to sort of unravel it, and then maybe at the end of the episode it gets solved and there's a new mystery, and you just keep one after the other like breadcrumbs, and it's a way to keep people really hooked. He says there is a positive relationship between curiosity and knowledge. So you have some information about something, you're curious, then the more information you start to get about it, the more curious you become. This also ties in with something called goal gradient theory. So the closer to a goal that you are, the more motivated you become. He says people insert themselves into story information gaps. And also another really good example of this is if you think about the Volkswagen commercial that came out a few years ago for the Super Bowl, and it had a little kid that was wearing a Darth Vader outfit and he was trying to control the car. What's really good about that is you can't see the kid, so it allows people to project onto that. So for example, they might imagine their own children in that situation much easier. Also, if you just explain everything to somebody in a story, it's kind of boring. What you want to do is you want to make inferences and implications, and then when you do that, people will create their own kind of theories as to what's going on, and that's how people insert themselves. A really good example of this is the movie Phone Booth. It's a situation where Colin Farrell plays a character who's stuck in a phone booth. On the other side of the road there's a sniper, and he's got him on the phone, and if you watch that film, you will notice you will come up with crazy scenarios constantly of what would I do, how would I get out of this, what would I say. You insert yourself into a situation where there's gaps for that to be inserted. So it's another really powerful technique. He says brains rebuild the confusion of reality into simplified theories of cause and effect. And these are essentially what create our beliefs. It's called our theory of control. So, I mean, obviously no one walks around with a set of if-then rules in their head where, I could walk up to you and say, so what's your if-then rule for catching a bus? How long do you wait before you give up and do something else? This stuff really works like underneath the hood. It's not something that we're that consciously aware of, but they do exist. And essentially the reason we have these rules is we've learned them over time is because one of the most important things to any creature living on this earth is to be able to predict its environment. When you cannot predict your environment, you become very stressed. That's why if you're driving down the road and you suddenly end up in a huge tailback and you've got to be somewhere shortly and then you're stuck in traffic for 2 hours, you'll be very angry and frustrated. It's because you weren't able to predict the situation. Likewise, if you were driving down the road and you got a funny sense that the driver in front of you was about to swerve and you sort of got a little cautious and you started to brake and he did swerve in front of you, whilst you would be angry, there would also be a small amount of pleasure in your mind because you actually predicted the situation. The reason that we want to be able to predict everything is because once you can predict things, then you can start figuring out how to control them. And of course, that's what all animals do. They try to control their environments to maximize their exploitation of the environment. In a good story, you'll have a character that has this theory of control. So if we think of the film Fracture with Ryan Gosling playing a lawyer, he's one of these lawyers that's kind of like never lost, never had any problems, and then suddenly he meets his match. His theory of control is completely thrown out, and he's in this mental battle with Anthony Hopkins. And it's a really great film because that's the kind of thing that makes a great story, is you have to see the main character thrown such a curveball that suddenly they've got to try to regain control. And that normally is what the second act of the film is they're trying to regain control of their environment. And so when you make an attack on these beliefs, it's an attack on the person's very reality. So these kinds of attacks drive some of our greatest stories. And of course, that film I just mentioned is a great example as well. The protagonist will go through, like I said, in the second act, and they will face a battle to reimpose control. The next point is active grammar means readers model the scenes as if they are really there. So a great example of this would be if you were reading a book and it said the princess kissed Killian, then you would see that in your head and it would construct as if you were there. Whereas if you said Killian was kissed by the princess, it wouldn't do the same job. And of course, the whole point of storytelling is to try and create very accurate imagery in the person's mind so that they can experience something called narrative transformation, where they actually feel they're really there in the story. The reason this is so important is because when you get somebody into that state, their attitudes and their beliefs become malleable and you can actually influence people. And the final point worth making, and this kind of ties in with the last one, is that story is therefore both tribal propaganda and it's also the cure for tribal propaganda. Because as we all know, stories can be used to influence people, tell people stories about themselves and their groups and make them very angry and resentful. And then the same stories can also be used to deprogram the same people and make them realize that, there's a world of possibilities out there. They're not victims. There's plenty of examples I could go into, but essentially that's where story is powerful, is because it can be used to manipulate people. So I should always use it ethically. Okay, so that is my top 10 takeaways from both of those books. So what are my final thoughts? Well, firstly, stories that stick is good for a high-level audience. Personally, I think the notes that I've given you should be enough for if you're in the C-suite. There aren't that many good takeaways from the book, but the ones that are there are really good. The problem is you have to wade through, ironically, a bunch of long stories to get to the key takeaways. So if this is a book that interests you, I think what I've already given you should be enough, unless you want a deep dive into those template stories like the value story, the purpose story, and so forth. The science of storytelling, this is a much deeper explanation of the science of stories, and it spends as much time talking about the human mind and its evolutionary underpinnings as it does story itself. So if this isn't something that really interests you, you don't really want to get deep down into the science, you want something more high level, then you may prefer stories that stick. But people like me, I want to understand how everything works, like on a scientific basis, just so that I can back anything up that I say and I can make sure what I'm saying is accurate. Also, when you have understanding of that level, then you can start tying things to other domains. So for example, I can see such a strong link between the book, The Science of Storytelling, and then some of the things I've learned from evolutionary psychology, for example. So there's a world of possibilities there. It just depends on how deep you want to go. If you're a C-suite person, you probably aren't interested in any of that. You're just like, give me the key takeaways I need so I can tell more influential stories in my business. And so if that's the case, then stories that stick would be a better one for you. So ultimately, I preferred The Science of Storytelling. So from this first ever book fight, I can declare that The Science of Storytelling wins. So that's all for me. A little bit different this time. If you liked that and you want to see more reviews done in that format, then let me know and I'd be quite happy to do it. I had a bit of fun doing it this way. I was actually inspired because I follow a YouTube channel where they take different movies and they rate them against each other this way as well. In fact, some of the funnier ones, they actually have brackets of 16 and then they play them out like you would see in the basketball brackets all the way to the end to see who's the best, and they have a panel discussing them. And heck, I might even be willing to do that if you guys are interested. I could wait to a customer experience conference and get a few people together and we could do something like that. So just let me know, give me some feedback, and I will see you again shortly with another book review. Thanks guys, take care.